October 22nd, 1950. Just a month ago, the North Korean forces had the UN forces compressed into a tiny corner at the bottom of South Korea. But the fortunes of war can quickly change. And not only did those forces break out, this week they take Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the UN forces advanced across the 38th parallel into North Korea in force. On the east coast, advancing far enough to take the port of Wonsan. Unknown to the world, though, troops from Communist China were crossing into North Korea from the other end to help their beleaguered ally. And on Wake Island, UN Forces Commander Douglas MacArthur and US President Harry Truman met with their advisors and other top brass. There are some myths going round about that meeting. That MacArthur wanted his plane to be delayed so that the president would have to wait for him. That is not true. It is true, though, that MacArthur did not salute Truman, nor did he even greet American Secretary of the Army Frank Pace. I'll briefly go over what is discussed once again at this 90-minute-long meeting, the last day of last week. MacArthur says that Korea is basically won, and they touch on the subject of post-war Korea. Truman asks about the chances of Chinese or Soviet intervention, and MacArthur says it's not going to happen. The war will be over by Thanksgiving, and they can start the paperwork for moving the 2nd Infantry Division out of Korea and over to Europe. At one point, when the meeting seemed to be going far too quickly, Dean Rusk tried to slow it down a bit, fearing that the skeptical press corps would seize on the brevity and write that this confirmed it was all about public relations. Halberstam goes on to write a bit more along those lines. The meeting in the end had been false in almost every sense. A potentially great threat to the UN had been minimized. How to deal with it, barely discussed. MacArthur had been more right about the meeting than anyone realized. It had been about sharing the Incheon glory in the last weeks before an off-year election. That is certainly plausible. Politics is always politics. The investigative journalist I.F. Stone has a different spin on this meeting, though. I mentioned 2 weeks ago that 2 American fighter planes attacked a Soviet airport 100 kilometers north of Korea on October 8th. The next day, the Soviets charged that this was deliberate and demanded the punishment of those involved. This was in a note to the American Minister Counselor in Moscow, who refused to accept the note, claiming this was a UN matter. On the 10th, the U.S. State Department formally refused to acknowledge the charge, which was pretty much without precedent. The incident was revealing. If the charge was untrue, the United States had everything to gain by indicting the USSR before the United Nations for falsehood. If the attack was accidental, a reply pointing this out would have allayed the fears felt at the UN that just such an incident might occur to widen the conflict. If MacArthur's headquarters was concerned about UN reactions, it might have felt a little diplomatic lying advisable. If he wanted to keep the war localized, Tokyo headquarters would certainly not have acted with what may be termed effrontery. The message to the USSR was unmistakable. Yeah, and what are you gonna do about it? Soviet leader Joseph Stalin does not wish to be provoked into a war, and it seems like he just swallowed this, not sending any protest to the UN. Although such a protest would sort of acknowledge that the UN action in Korea is a lawful one in the face of invasion, which the Soviets never have acknowledged. But did he really just let it slide? Okay, Truman had planned to have some free time after October 8th, and on the 10th, the White House announced he was going to St. Louis on family business. Then they announced he was heading to meet MacArthur halfway across the Pacific. Why the sudden change of plans for a meeting that is uniformly described as superficial? Here's Stone's take on it. This week on the 19th, the U.S. gives a note from MacArthur to the UN admitting the attack on the Soviet airport, but saying it was not under orders and was an accident. Navigation error and poor judgment. And the commander of the Air Force group responsible has been relieved from duty and that they're taking disciplinary action against the 2 pilots. MacArthur says the U.S. publicly regrets the incident and will pay any reparations deemed necessary. This is very much a complete about-face. Stone's hypothesis is that during the 21 minutes between the first meeting at Wake between just Truman and MacArthur, and the actual conference, 21 minutes without a record when MacArthur and Truman talked with only their advisors present, came the real reason for the whole Wake Island ordeal. To meet face to face so Truman could get MacArthur to come to heel. I am inclined to believe that the private talk between Truman and MacArthur was held primarily to discuss the bombing of Soviet territory. The bombing occurred on the 8th. The Soviet note calling it to Washington's attention was on the 9th. Truman's decision to see MacArthur personally was announced on the 10th. The Wake Island meeting took place on the 15th. 4 days later, Warren Austin presented the United States with a note from MacArthur admitting the attack on the Soviet aerodrome and promising disciplinary action against those responsible. I suspect there must have been something from the Russians tantamount to an ultimatum to make Truman dash halfway across the Pacific to deal with this affair and to elicit an apology from MacArthur. Soviet territory was not bombed again. The Air Force confined its mistakes thenceforward to the Manchurian border. Stone has written for The Nation and the New York Post, but has been blacklisted now in 1950, likely because in the 1930s he was part of both the Popular Front and the League of American Writers, both of which were largely made up of either Communist Party members or fellow travelers. Stone was never an actual party member as far as I can tell. Should there ever, just throwing it out there, should there ever, after Stone's death way in the future, be allegations that he was a Soviet agent, those allegations would likely never be proven. And indeed, I imagine they would only be based on pretty flimsy hearsay cobbled together. Anyhow, this idea of his is just speculation, but so too is the idea that Truman was just holding the meeting for PR purposes. I do not know which is true or if both or neither are. At any rate, all sources agree that Truman left Wake Island all smiles and publicly said he had never had a more satisfactory conference in his whole presidency, while MacArthur seemed surly and declined to make any comments whatsoever. I went over last week how MacArthur and Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong felt about the thought of China joining the war. Mao had already planned to do so, and his troops were and are crossing the Yalu River into North Korea. MacArthur firmly believes China would do no such thing, so he might be in for a big surprise. But what do the other top dogs in U.S. command think of things? Quiet, modest Omar Bradley, was one of the best military brains in the business, was thinking of the massive Soviet divisions, at least 175 in the satellite countries alone, positioned in Europe. To him, all-out war with China would be war with the wrong enemy, at the wrong place, at the wrong time. The United States had to bear the load in Asia, true, but its vital interest lay in Europe, and its greatest danger in Soviet Russia. Truman has his gang of advisors. Well, these guys have been called the architects of containment, meaning they see it as both hopeless and pointless to actually try to conquer or even just subdue the Soviets and Chinese in the endless landmass of Asia. It might be doable with a nuclear holocaust, but that's about it, and Truman has no wish to set Armageddon in motion. Preventing the expansion of communism, even should it cost a lot of American blood, is another thing, though. As for the Soviets, well, the U.S. didn't just stand by in June and let a small friendly state, South Korea, get overrun. And the Soviets aren't going to just stand by with North Korea either, but it's tricky. Joseph Stalin does not want a general war with the U.S. any more than Harry Truman once won with him. Stalin has no illusions about that. The USSR still has big scars from World War II, and the U.S. has an overwhelming nuclear advantage. But that does not mean Stalin isn't willing to take some risks. But how could he avoid the direct clash that would lead to a general war? Well, the West has accepted Soviet arms in the hands of satellite states. There have been crises that were supported on the one side by the Soviets and the U.S. on the other. The Iran crisis, the Greek Civil War, the First Indochina War. So maybe substituting the Chinese for the North Koreans would be a similar situation, which again is something Mao Zedong has been working towards for many weeks now and is going ahead with his plans, for several reasons I've already talked about. However, there were other reasons to go ahead. Entering the war was proof that new China could no longer be abused and exploited by foreign powers. Selling this idea to the vast percentage of the Chinese people, Mao was sure, would not be that hard. His propaganda wars, in fact, had already begun. The State Department had published its China White Paper in August 1949. The White Paper was designed to relieve pressure at home to show that the administration had done all that it could to help what was a self-destructive nationalist government and that the collapse was Chiang's own fault. But in China, Mao understood immediately its unique propaganda value. It was a gift from heaven. Absolute documentary evidence of how insidiously the Americans had manipulated and exploited the government of Chiang only for the good of the United States. The Americans, his line went, were never your friends, and he launched a ferocious nationwide propaganda campaign that stunned Washington. Chiang is Chiang Kai-shek, whose nationalist regime was defeated by Mao's communists last year in the Chinese Civil War. Let's take a look at what Mao has planned for Korea. When the Korean War began in June, the Chinese 4th Field Army, commanded by Lin Piao, marched towards the Korean border, some 600,000 men total. Units from his army began crossing the Yalu River last week after the American troops crossed the 38th parallel. From this massive field army, the 39th and 40th armies crossed from Dandong to Sinwiju, and the 38th and 42nd crossed from Jian to Mampojin. I should point out that here in 1950, the Chinese army is roughly equal in size to an American corps. So these 4 armies have 3 divisions each of like 10,000 men, meaning that by now there are 120,000 Chinese troops in Korea. They are all under the CCF 13th Army Group and are backed by artillery and mounted cavalry regiments. CCF is the Chinese Communist Forces. 3 of these armies take up positions in U.S. 8th Army's line of advance in the west, and the other sets up in front of Chosin Reservoir to the east in what is going to be U.S. 10th Corps zone, assuming they finally land at Wonsan, which the South Koreans took last week. 2 more Chinese armies plan to cross next week with another army group to follow them. And Mao may have told the world that he would send force to fight for North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, but he's not sending any forces to fight under Kim. The CCF is keeping control of its forces. This is probably the best thing for them, since Lin Piao and most of the other Chinese generals and commanders are the products of either China's Whampoa Military Academy or one of the Soviet ones. These are guys that have as thorough a military education as anyone from West Point or Sandhurst. They've also been in active wars for just about their entire adult lives and have a serious wealth of experience. They are good. As for their men, the hordes of the Red Army were tough and battle-hardened, but they could not read or write. They had no radios, nor did they have much telephone equipment. They had no air force, nor any massive artillery. They were weak in motor transport. Their arms were a miscellany of United States, Japanese, and Russian equipment. They had very few of the things a European or Western army required for war. This is not, however, a Western battlefield, and Peng Dehuai, who commands the whole People's Volunteer Army, plans to only work with their advantages, one of which is a war of fluid maneuver without any regard for set battle lines, and another is that their enemy is unaware they even exist. A few words about this volunteer army, the PVA. Although the men in it would be very surprised to learn that they are volunteers. They are officially called volunteers to give the UN and the US the impression that China doesn't want to declare war on the United States, and that these are merely volunteer forces that have chosen to come to the aid of North Korea. The name is also a little homage to the Korean Volunteer Army who helped the Chinese communists in their civil war and the war against Japan. They are, however, as you may have guessed, elements of the PLA, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, Mao's Red Chinese Army. You may have wondered how the U.S. is not aware that they are in Korea. American planes fly over North Korea every single day. But the Chinese do not advance by day. You can look at one Chinese army to illustrate their methods. Its assembly area is nearly 500 kilometers from its jumping off point, right? They begin to march after dark, after 9 p.m. They march and sing songs until exactly 3 a.m., covering 33 kilometers. They do this night after night after night, and by the time the dawn comes, every man Every gun, every horse, everything is hidden from sight. The discipline against anyone showing themselves is so rigid that anyone violating this instruction is shot. These are thick forests and deep valleys here, and by day, the only activity is scouting parties out to find that nice route. These have orders that if they hear a plane, they are to freeze where they stand until the sound dies away. So hundreds of sorties over the Chinese and even aerial photography shows nothing. As for the UN forces, the Chinese know everything about them. They are very obviously marching north up the east and west sides of the peninsula, getting more and more strung out into isolated formations as the road network becomes more and more non-existent. Okay, that's not really happening just yet, since a lot of the UN forces, particularly in the west, are still relatively close to the 38th parallel. This week, it's a race to be the first to Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. There was a great deal of confusion. The 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, for example, reached the town of Sariwon on one road before large numbers of North Koreans fleeing before U.S. 24th Division on another road. On the night of the 17th and 18th, the North Koreans passed through the town, ran into roadblocks north of it, passed back through the town a second time, and were finally broken up and captured in the morning. Throughout the night, isolated British or Australians pretended they were Russians, while isolated North Koreans pretended they were South Koreans. The ROK forces a little further east make better progress since they have to fight fewer of the enemy. The ROK is the South Koreans. In fact, part of the ROK 6th Division are even heading west towards Pyongyang from around Wonsan. They can conceivably cut the highway and railway leading north out of Pyongyang. So the KPA, the Northern Army, realizes once the enemy reaches Sariwon, and with the ROK coming from the east, that if they mount a strong defense of Pyongyang, it will inevitably result in capture or destruction. So they're withdrawing all the way up to Kangye, which is strategically great for defense. By the evening of the 17th, the drive for Pyongyang is on by 4 separate ROK divisions and 3 divisions from the U.S. 1st Corps, with the ROK 1st Division attached to 1st Corps being the closest, around 25 or so kilometers to the southeast. U.S. 1st Cavalry Division has the task of leading the attack on Pyongyang. There is a rumor among the men that this is their final objective of the war, and after taking it, they can go home. So morale is really high. The 7th Cavalry Regiment is the furthest north from the division, and its 3rd Battalion at Hwangju gets the nod as Assault Battalion, advancing with the dawn on the 18th. At Hukyo, about halfway to Pyongyang, they run into a reinforced KPA defense position with tanks dug in, the road mined, mortars and machine guns, and some 800 enemy soldiers. The fight to break this position lasts all day. That night, the other 2 cavalry battalions come up on the flanks, and when morning comes the 19th, the enemy positions are found abandoned. 5th Cavalry, meanwhile, has by then gotten the order to pass through 7th Cavalry here and head for Pyongyang. At just past 11 a.m., advance units reach a tributary of the Taedong River at the southern edge of the city. Over the next few hours, they slowly fight their way into the city. As units of 1st Cavalry Division enter the city, ROK 1st Division units are also entering from positions to their northeast. On the 18th, it still seemed like they would hit Pyongyang before the Americans or the British. But they have a heavier fight that day, and the road they travel has both anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. So the going is slower, and the advance into the city is pretty much a tie, as it turns out, though ROK troops managed to ford the river before the others do. ROK 1st Division Commander Paik Sun-yip explains to the Americans that he found a ford so quickly because he happens to be a native of Pyongyang, and he knows the fords. ROK troops secure the airfield by 3 p.m. and Kim Il-sung University by 6 p.m. On the 20th, they take the center of the city pretty easily, and at 10 a.m. report the city secure. There is now a special task force that has a job. This is Task Force Indian Head, who get their name from the shoulder patch of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division. They enter Pyongyang with the advance units of 1st Cavalry Division, and their job is to search all the government buildings and all buildings that house foreign entities to find any and all intelligence materials. They actually do find a fair amount of both military and political intel, which they turn over to command in Tokyo. In Pyongyang, 20 American POWs are rescued, but the rest of what is a large number of POWs held have been taken north with the KPA. Hobart Gay, 1st Cavalry Division commander, sets up his command in the North Korean Military Academy southwest of the city. He is now responsible for the city. 8th Army Headquarters is established today, the 22nd, in Kim Il-sung's former headquarters building. 2 days from now, 8th Army Commander Walton Walker will arrive to take personal command here. The route north to the Yalu has one major feature about halfway there, the Chongchon River. To try to cut off retreat, capture North Korean government staff, and hopefully rescue American POWs, MacArthur sends his only airborne unit, the 187th Regimental Combat Team, to drop in a blocking position on the 20th. This has 2 battalions, and one drops to Suncheon and the other to Sukcheon, blocking both roads north from the capital. MacArthur observed the operation, the first in which heavy equipment was parachuted in with the troops, and pronounced it a great success. Technically it was, but it did little to the North Koreans. Their government had long fled, and there were few troops south of the blocking position, most of them having already crossed the Chongchon. This week on the 21st, north of Suncheon, the Americans find a mass grave. They also find some living prisoners who have feigned death and managed to survive. Apparently, the KPA stopped a train here, took 100 or so Americans off the train, supposedly for them to have dinner, and then shot them while they were sitting in circles waiting to be fed. Over 70 bodies are found, and over 20 survivors, most of them wounded. As for rescuing POWs on a large scale, they are disappointed time and again. Regularly during the advance, the UN forces found escaped prisoners wandering around the hills. Local peasants also frequently led them to new graves, where prisoners had been executed and hastily buried. There was constant rumor of trains full of POWs who were always just a little bit ahead, or hidden in a tunnel, or off on another spur line, like the El Dorado of the conquistadors. And the 18th week of the Korean War comes to its end, with Kim Il-sung losing his capital, but getting backup in the form of well over 100,000 Chinese soldiers, and Douglas MacArthur issuing a very un-MacArthur-like apology. What if MacArthur halts the non-Korean elements of his forces and only sends the ROK units forwards to the Yalu to unite Korea? That's what the UN talked about, and that's what they want. A buffer zone of Koreans near the borders with China and the USSR, and Americans or British troops or whoever else nowhere near them. No direct provocation. What if he does that? It's a silly question because he has no intention of doing that, and thus does not realize that very soon he's going to run into Mao Zedong's army. Will that escalate into a larger war, a world war? Maybe. But either way, it's obvious that the Korean War is only getting more and more dangerous on a global level. It is the Time Ghost Army that can maintain our operations of spreading history on a global level. The Man in the Sand, good name, is the Time Ghost Army member of the week, and these are the new commissioned officers. You too can join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com to get ever more of this fantastic content. If you'd like to see some of our earlier fantastic content, here is an episode we did on the Time Ghost History Channel several years ago about Mao Zedong and the Long March. Check it out. It is very good. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.